welcome, Joel.
Hey, Eric.
So everyone, this is Joel Billings of 2x3 Games, and we speak with each other quite often about what we're going to talk about today, which is the upcoming Gary Grigsby's War in the East 2, since we're working on the project together. But I'm very glad that we're going to get a chance to share some information about this release, to pull back the curtain and get the audience excited and talk to the wargaming community directly about it. Now, I think that most of the people tuning in today to this stream about war games have probably heard your name and Gary's in the past and have probably played some of your games. There are really so many awards and accolades to go through that I don't know that I can really mention them, but you guys are pretty much the Hall of Fame as far as a war game team goes. And I think a lot of us, including me, can honestly say that our careers and the path we chose has been inspired and influenced a lot by what you and Gary have accomplished. So for those that may be newer to wargaming, I want to talk a bit about your careers, though, because your and Gary's history sort of coincides, and in a large part is involved in and responsible for creating strategy and wargaming on the computer. So before we get into War in the East 2 specifically, could you talk for a bit about the timeline from Strategic Simulations Incorporated to the present, how 2x3 Games came to be, and if you can think of a good one, share a story from development, one of your favorite stories about the games you've worked on.
Okay. All right. Well, it started in 1979 when I started SSI, when I graduated from college. And in 1982, I think it was, we published Gary's first game, which was a Guadalcanal campaign. And from that point, I got to work with Gary on 25 games, I think, over the next 20 years at SSI. And everything from Kampfgruppe to Steel Panthers, all kinds of things that Gary did. And it basically, SSI was sold in 94 to Mindscape. And I stayed with SSI for about 5 or 6 years with Mindscape SSI. And in 2000, when I left there, Gary and I decided that we wanted to keep working together. And we started 2x3 Games along with Keith Brewers. Keith had been, he came in as a tech support call answer guy in like 1982 or so, around the same time Gary first came in. And he had become a programmer, one of SSI's top programmers on games like Pool of Radiance. And he had also done a lot of the tools that Gary had used through the years. We called them Hex Pack, Square Pack, to do all the war games that Gary had worked on. So basically, we started 2x3 Games as World War II by 3 guys, which was Keith, Gary, and myself. And with the idea we'd be focused on World War II games. And that started in 2000. And then we started off with the very first thing we were going to work on was a War in the East game. And literally, so in the summer of 2000, we started that project. We got about 5 months in working on that project and decided, the computers just weren't powerful enough for what we wanted to do. So we shelved that project and we started working on Uncommon Valor and then War in the Pacific, which was another set of monster products that the computers were barely ready for. But we were able to do those. Anyway, so over the last 20 years, Gary and I and with Keith for the first 10 years of that basically worked on a number of games as part of 2x3 Games. And we have a virtual office with people who contribute and help us all around the world. So that's sort of the history. In 2009 or so, Keith went back to Silicon Valley and the mainstream programming, I'd say. And we at that point, we were lucky enough to find somebody from our testing group who came in, Pavel Zagzin, and he became a big part of our projects going forward. And the War in the East, War in the West, and now War in the East too, and it's a big part of the team. So, and as far as the stories from development go, well, one story is how I met Gary. Was basically in 1981 we released a game called Torpedo Fire, which was a sub simulation game, and Gary called in, and I was the technical support person. Basically, would answer the questions of anybody who called in, and I answered Gary's call. And after talking for a while, he said he had been fooling around on his computer. He just got an Apple computer, and he was fooling around making a game. And would we be interested in looking at it? I said, absolutely. Send it in when you have something worth looking at. And amazingly, within about a month or two, he sent it in, and within 6 months, we published Wild Canal Campaign. So we're lucky enough to get them, and then another similar kind of story was in 2009 when we were working on War in the East. We had started getting some testers in to help us, and Pavel was one of the testers who was basically giving us a lot of good feedback and criticism on our map. And he basically started saying, he lived in Vilnius in Lithuania, and he had a lot of interest in the War in the East and in the geography, and we could do a better job on our map. And so I said, great, you want to help us? You want to?
Yeah, you just talked yourself into a job.
Yeah, you just got a job with us. So he basically started helping us with the map, and luckily we found out that he also had some programming skills that he had started up, and over time he just kept doing more and more. Mm-hmm. And before you knew it, he was part of the team and basically co-programmer with Gary and designer, and so it's been the three of us ever since now on with War in the West, War in the East, War in the West, and now War in the East too.
Thanks. Those great stories. And I'll just say, for those who didn't grow up wargaming in the 80s like I did, I mean, it was all about SSI. It was, the games that when I look back at, the things that got me into wargaming on the computer, it was games from SSI. It was games that you published, a lot of them that you and Gary worked on together. And then there were strategy games and role-playing games, a lot of which Keith also worked on. It's just, it's privileged to still have a chance to, at this point, be making games with you and with Gary. And let me actually pivot from there to talking about War in the East 2 specifically. Now, you mentioned just now that you've had in the last 10 years, you and Gary and Pavel worked on War in the East and War in the West, and now War in the East 2. So it's really part of a series. And in a lot of ways, that goes back to the beginning of 2x3 games when you first started working on War in the East and shelved it. So in a way, we're sort of coming back full circle now with War in the East 2. We're going back to the first War in the East, but in a completely new way. These types of monster war games are sort of your signature, Gary's signature. And I think a lot of people may initially think, oh, a monster war game, that's a lot to manage. But they're actually remarkably playable. They come with a lot of smaller scenarios as well, and they are remarkably engrossing. I mean, when I sit down for a test session and I say, all right, I've got, 2 hours to play some more in these two, before I know it, the 2 hours is gone. I mean, it just goes by in a flash because you get so into these games. And I've heard a lot of wargamers talk about their experiences with War in the East and War in the West as some of their pinnacle experiences in the hobby in general, just because of how much historical detail is in these games and how engrossed you get into them. So now that I've finished pumping it up a little bit, if you were to give a brief sort of elevator pitch, just a few sentences of sort of how you see War in the East 2, and why you decided that to come back and give War in the East another look. So to someone who hasn't played any of the previous games, why would you say that War in the East 2 is a war game, worth looking at? And also, if you want to pitch it to someone who has played the previous games.
All right. Well, you're basically talking about the largest land campaign in history. So if you have an interest in that, and then you take a game that tries to resolve it down to the individual tank and plane and man, and so you get an immense amount of detail. So then the question is, well, how do you play this? Well, uh, War in the East has the advantage of you can start small. You can start, as you mentioned, you start with the smaller scenarios, and then you build up to the grand campaign, of 200 turns, where literally each turn in the campaign is a game in itself, and it's really what it comes down to. And you can push pieces around, and that's the nice thing. That was our goal with War in the East One. That you could be simple. You could get into it quickly. You could have fun just moving pieces around, trying to make an encirclement here or there. Okay. But then, which you find is, so you've got that addictive quality that comes in with the game too, that you want to make the next attack, you want to make the next move. And so there's a big quality of that in the game as well. And basically, that it allows you to get into it easily, but there's so much depth that you keep finding you want to get into. Okay, well, what happens here? Why, if I do this, if I change this depot here, how does that change things? Or and so there's so many different layers in the game that you can play it at the surface level, you can play it at the deeper level. Now, War in the East 2 has even more in terms of ways to get at that information and the detail that's there. But it also gives you a few things like the AI, which is incredibly challenging, and we think Gary's best AI, that he's made in a game. But it's also there to help you at the beginning. So we have an AI assist for the air game and for the logistics game, which are two big parts of the game, to help you get into the game as a beginner and as you first step in. So if you're just new to war games or new to this kind of game, you can get into it. Hopefully, it is accessible, but you have to try not to learn everything all at once. You just can't. There's just too much going on. So you just play it, and we think it's enjoyable enough at that level. But then you're gonna find you want to find out more, and you're going to want to read up on the history, because that's going to actually help you in the game and understand why things are happening the way they are in the game, and why you're doing better now because you suddenly realize some key point. So that's what I think is what makes it unique. It is a massive game, but it is equally as fun at the small scenario level as it is at the big campaign. But everybody wants to play the big campaign. Ultimately, that's what they go for.
Yeah, well, I mean, I know some of the first impressions we've heard in the past, um, from the historical standpoint, are just people, who open up the game, and it's like the entire Eastern Front in the box. They just look at it and they start browsing around, and their mind boggles, because if you want to keep drilling down, there's so much rich historical information. There's so many basically reference books, all distilled down into one easy to access view. And yeah, it's a war game, it's a strategy game, but at the same time, it's like an encyclopedia of the Eastern Front that's dynamic and it unfolds as you play. So
Yeah.
I think there's a this idea of sort of you're there, the game brings the Eastern Front alive for you, and you can really see all the military aspects, the military challenges that the commanders were dealing with at that time. Now, since we started work on War and These Two, it's been pretty clear to me that you guys really were taking it as a major effort. You weren't content to rest with your laurels with the original War in the East one, that you decided to basically take another look at everything and all the feedback, all the ideas that had come up since War in the East one and through War in the West, that you were interested in going back and making it better in pretty much every way than its predecessors. So I'd like to get into some of those features specifically, some of which you mentioned briefly just now, but let's dig into the details. So first, I wanted to talk about the map. Now, I know that it is a more accurate map than War in the East map by quite a lot, based on a more accurate projection. It seems to perform better, and it also looks better than War in the West's map, and better than War in the East map as far as weather is concerned. Um, what do you feel the map changes from the original War in the East have added to War in the East 2?
Right. Well, there's some big ones like the double rail lines versus single rail lines. It sounds like a small thing, but it's actually a huge part of the the rail traffic and logistics was a huge part of the war. So we've got that in, and we've got a rail system. A road system in now as well. We used to, in War in the West, we rated every hex as to whether it was a good quality roads or average or poor. And in War in the East, you actually War in these two, you see these on the map. So the very few good quality roads in the Eastern Front in the Soviet Union are very important, and they make a huge difference in the game. You have to pay attention to where the road network is. Even the average roads are going to be a huge difference, especially when you get to the mud season. And you mentioned weather. I mean, the integration, the weather system that Paulo worked on here is an extension of what he did in War in the West, which I challenge anybody to have a better weather system than what's in this game, as far as weather fronts coming in and the effects of the different kinds of weather. The mud, the heavy mud, and then the freeze over. Where you suddenly can move again, but before you then get the heavy snow that kicks in, and the fact that the map is built graphically so that you can now actually see these different layers of weather on the map, and still read the map, read the text on the map, and the town names and so on. It makes it just a much more playable and usable map as well. And even John worked on the map. I think we've got some trees changing color over the seasons in the game. So you've got some touches in there like that. So.
And I'll say, touching on the logistics part that you mentioned, with the single and double rails and the influence of the roads, it's massive. I mean, War in the East 1 had a good supply system. War in the West improved on it, but War in the East 2 system, with this addition of the single and double rails, and the way that the depots and the rail capacity work and everything, I found that it pretty much tracks exactly with what I've read, at least historically, about the challenges that they were dealing with logistically and where those challenges were the greatest. And boy, does it bring that home to you as you play.
Yeah, up until War in the East, up until and through War in the East, you had rails, and you had sort of a distance from the rail that you could be supplied. And that was, going back to the original War in the East board game, there was the old magic, 10 hexes from your rail lines. You were gods as German forces coming into the Soviet Union. And when you were 11 hexes away, if I remember right, you suddenly couldn't do anything. And that's not right. That's an abstraction, obviously, that's very clear. Love that game, though. And with War in the East, as I said, when we shelved the project in 2000, one of the problems was the computer wasn't capable of doing what we want to do with the rails. And even with War in the East 1, we had to simplify and stay fairly abstract. With War in the West, that was really the first time we were able to move to a more realistic logistical system. And we had to, because we had to deal with D-Day and the logistics of moving stuff onto the continent. So we dealt with that in War in the West. By the time we got to War in the East, thankfully, the computers had gotten stronger, and we were able to deal with double rail lines versus single rail lines.
Right.
And merge that with what we'd learned in War in the West. So this has been a project going from War in the East to War in the East 2. It's 10 years now, but with the stop of War in the West in between, and it's really allowed us to do a lot of things that we want to do. I mean, all games have abstractions to them, and you have to. And even in ours, there are abstractions. But the more we can drill down and get some of these key items, dealt with, I think the more fidelity we get to the history.
And I will say, as a player, if you keep track of some, important rules to follow, and you stick by those rules, the logistical system will do the rest. But if you want to drill down again and look into those details, and see the freight moving around and the trucks, bringing the supplies from the depots to the units, all that information is in there. And you can watch that happen and watch way too many of your trucks break down.
Yeah, sure.
All right, one other thing that we get a lot of the testers commenting on very positively, versus War in the West and War in the East 1, is this new interplay, interaction, synergy, whatever you want to call it, between the movement and combat system, because some of the changes that you've made with admin movement, preparation points, and combat delay. I wonder if you'd talk about those for a bit.
Sure. So we've been able to bring in some rules for combat preparation. For example, it gives you over time you build up combat prep, and it's basically more helpful to the attacker than the defender. So you have a way to build up for an offensive. I mean, that was a huge part of the Eastern Front activity. Was you'd have a build up to an offensive, and then you'd unleash the offensive, and it would go like gangbusters for a while, and then eventually it starts to peter out. So how do we get that? How do we avoid a Sitzkrieg situation? How do we give players the capability to get this? So with the logistics system, the combat prep, you have that ability to sort of, if you build up your forces right, you can release them and get the dynamic effects of that. Admin movement is basically you can move around a lot faster in friendly territory in your rear area than you can when you're moving through enemy territory or freshly conquered territory. That's factored into the game now. So it combines with the road system to make it so you can really move quite easily in some areas, whereas before you wouldn't be able to do that. So that's a realistic part of the game. But it's all these things are automatically factored in for you. So as you're moving your units around, you're not having to remember all these rules. If you had to remember these rules, you cannot play this. This is not a game you could play as a board game. There's that much going on, but it's so easy with the computer, of course, to be able to do it. And that goes back 40 years now. What have we been trying to do with computer war games? Take the stuff that we love about board war games, put them on the computer, and then do things you couldn't do in a board game, and make them easy for you to do. So that's admin movement. Combat delay is basically the idea that in order to you have to punch a hole in the line, but it takes you need to punch a hole quickly. You can't wait. It's a weekly turn. So if it takes you 6 days to punch a hole, you shouldn't be able to go through very far, and before the other player reacts. So combat delay is a factor of how we deal with that. So if you can overwhelm the defender, you could get a small combat delay. It basically simulates you're getting through there very quickly in the turn, and you can go through there and do your big enveloping movement. Otherwise, but if the defender, keeps it hard, makes it hard to get through that front line, then you won't be able to do it. So all these different mechanisms come in to give you a more realistic game.
I wanted to talk about a couple things you had touched on before. One of them you just did, which is we've put a lot of effort in War and These 2 into improving the interface and putting enough information at the player's fingertips. Like you said, you don't have to keep track of everything. The stuff that's most important to you, we try to put front and center. At the same time, if you want to drill down and use some of the really powerful tools like the commander's report or the metrics screen to see how things are going, all those are improved now. Do you want to touch on that at all, as far as how that helps a player?
Sure. Well, the commander's report is just so much improved for those who played War in the East 1 and used that. They knew it as a powerful tool for you to get information and occasionally to do mass manipulation of your forces. You want to change your TO&E, your max TO&E percentage for your infantry divisions, a couple of clicks, boom, you've just changed 100 divisions over to a different TO&E percentage. Well, this CR screen, Pavel's done himself. It's even better. The filter capability on it, the ability to manipulate things with a few clicks, and then mass change things is great.
And this is one of the hidden secrets, that allows a player to play a game of this size and actually have it be a manageable task.
Right. Because when you're playing a small scenario, if you start with a tutorial and you only have 10 or 20 units, you can go to every individual unit detail screen and make the change right there. It's not a big deal. And you can still do that in the campaign. But let's face it, when you're dealing with, hundreds of units, thousands of units perhaps on the board, and you want to implement a change, you don't want to have to go to each one of those screens and do that. And so the CR screen really does give you a way to do that. And players who invest the time to look at that screen and use that screen, they're gonna be rewarded with huge time savings and the ability to do things they didn't realize they could do in the game.
So speaking of the interface, one of the other things that is interface related that we put a lot of effort into was how players access the air game and how they play with the air game. War in the East 1 had a relatively simple and straightforward air game. War in the West made it much more realistic to account for all the needs of the strategic air offensives. And now in War in the East 2, we've tried to give players what's effectively the best of both worlds. A simple, even automated way of managing your air on the map, but also all the detail and realism under the hood. So if you want to get into managing it in a more manual way, that you also can. And we're calling this the AOG system. And I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about what you think the AOG system is going to give players in War in the East 2 and what it's going to make possible versus War in the West and War in the East.
Sure. The AOG stands for Air Operational Group. And basically, we created this system where you take a number of air units and put them together into a group, an AOG, which could be a division, let's say, or you can have a core AOG, and then you have the Army Command, Air Command, or Luftfloat AOG. So at each level, you've got an air operational group that's tied up the chain. So just like you have divisions and corps and armies and with the ground units. And the system we've implemented now has the air units. You can access the information on the map a lot easier than before, but it also integrates with air bases, actual air bases on the map, which War in the East 1 didn't have. War in the East 1 had a very simple abstract air system. You moved air headquarters around, and in the air headquarters you had the air units. So they just moved wherever you wanted them to. Air bases didn't exist. Well, that was unrealistic. That was an abstraction. In War in the West, we had to go to individual air bases. We wanted to go to individual air bases for that level of detail. Gary's, bombing the Reich series of games, and before that, USAF. He had a whole series of air games. So he knows air games, and we wanted that detail in War in the West because the Strategic Air Command, the Strategic Air Bombing campaign of Germany was a huge part of the Western Front. So on the Eastern Front, it's a little different. You have ground support is the main, function of the air armies in the Eastern Front. Although there was some industrial bombing and there was certainly interdiction. It wasn't quite like the interdiction being done in Normandy and War in the West. But we wanted to bring that enhanced realistic air game over to War in the East. But we also knew we were dealing with thousands of planes. So we dealt with it in War in the West at some level, but we knew we could do more to make it easier to play with and for gamers to use. And so that's what the AOG system and the on-map AOGs basically give you that easier visibility, ease of use. And we've also tied in this AI Air Assist, which basically allows the starting player just to do some very simple things. And basically he can assign his air command to follow a front. And basically it will provide ground support for that front. You do have the ability to give a few detailed commands in there, but basically it's going to move your forces around, and it's going to assign the air missions and create the air directives for you. So you can start with that. Eventually, you're going to want to learn more, and you're going to want to learn how to actually go in and create your own air directives. And instead of just saying, I want to do naval operation, I want the Luftfloat 1 to do naval operations off of Helene, let's say, to cut that off. You may want to go and actually create some air directives to do that. So you can get into that detail in the air system if you want, or you can stay back basically and let the AI assist do it for you. So again, it's many layers, and it is the fact that the Soviets had 15,000 plane air force by the end of the war. active Air Force and more in reserve, and that's a lot going
Yeah.
on. So we had to make a system that would make it easier for the players to use. But the realism level there is much better than in War in the East 1, and you avoid the click fest, I think, that people saw in War in the East 1. With the way the system was operating, some people found ways to, if they managed to click a lot of times, they could find strategies to work, but it just shouldn't work.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize to players who haven't tried this out yet, if you're a big ground game fan, but you want to manage the air war at a higher level, really all you have to do is tell each of those AOGs, I want you to follow this army. I want you to do this basic type of, support and move the army HQs, move the air HQs, and you're done. And it works pretty well. It really does. I've been playing around with it primarily in most of my testing, and it has really made it so that I don't have to micromanage the air game. So I think those players who are happy with that style of play, you're going to be quite happy with the AOC system.
Yeah, with that, I'd say with gamers, you find there are a lot of air gamers, a lot of ground gamers, a lot of naval gamers. It's hard to and there are some that just love to put them all together. But we want to make a game that basically can attract different players. So
yeah, it suits each play style. Yeah, and then as far as the AI assist, now you mentioned earlier about the AI assistance, and we just talked about how it can assist you in the air game. We've also talked about how it can assist you logistically in building your depots for you. But you mentioned earlier a claim that you thought this was the best AI Gary has ever made. I just want to chime in here and say I agree. I think this is an amazing AI, and it has absolutely given me fits time and time again. I worked with you on War in the East and War in the West, and I played, as part of working through these, I've played against the AI many times, and I've never had one of those AIs play as well as this one has been. I think for the casual gamer, there's going to be a difficulty setting for them. For the experienced gamer, there's going to be a difficulty setting for them, and I think for even the best gamers, the best war gamers, the most experienced War in the East War and the best players, I think they're going to find their initial bouts against the AI to be quite challenging, and for it to be a really a very worthy opponent until they're ready to graduate to that human to human play.
I think players are going to have hundreds of hours easily against the AI that they'll feel like, okay, it's giving them a challenge. And as you said, you can crank up the difficulty level and basically make it harder if you want on yourself. But Gary's spent a lot of time on the AI. I mean, that has been a big focus. So Gary's known for incredibly detailed combat results systems at the micro level, and how to take that and expand it to suit a macro situation. And he's known for AI. He's really one of the early and best AI creators that in war games, I think. And that's no easy task. Let me tell you, he spends a lot of time on that, and but he's got a lot of history making these kinds of games.
There's a couple more areas I want to cover before we wrap up. One has to do with what we're calling the theater boxes, and the other has to do with the new victory system for the Grand Campaign. I'm going to let you take those away.
Okay, sure. The theater boxes basically are for the off-map areas. So for the Axis, North Africa, the Balkans, Italy, Western Europe, those kinds of areas where basically we've got all the units operating there and actually fighting off-map and taking casualties and so on. And there's an event system that goes along with it that basically will track these campaigns and what's going on. And we have the game starts off with all the historical transfers of units, but you can also take there's an option for enhanced theater box control. So basically, you can take more control over moving units back and forth between various theaters that are off map and the on map. Plus, you have a strategic reserve. Both sides have a strategic reserve box where they're moving units to rest and recuperate and so on. So it just you don't just have the Eastern Front. You've got the whole war in Europe basically going on, and you can see that through the event system and the theater boxes. And for the Soviets, you've got the Far East as well, and the Transcaucasus, and then you've got the Northern Front in Finland. And we did make a decision in this case to go with theater boxes for the Finnish War. Although you'll see the map covers the whole area of Finland up to the Arctic Sea, but basically that area we decided would be just a bridge too far for us to try to factor that area, because it was just such a different war at a different scale. And we've talked about doing an expansion that has some finished scenarios. So we're hoping to do that in the future. But you do have the theater box that deals with it. And if the Soviets take if the Germans take Leningrad, there are actually Finnish units and a Finnish Expeditionary Corps that can come on the map, so and participate in the on map activities. So you've got all that going on off map and around, and then you've got the victory system is different. We basically have a system where we track a German, what we call the high water mark. So if the Germans are scoring points by taking cities, by taking them early, quickly, they get bonus points. And then there's some points that are involved on from events and the other theaters of the war. Basically, all these go into a point total that the Axis are trying to get to a certain level of points in order to win the game automatically. And there's every quarter you track to see, okay, have you reached your automatic victory level? There's also a sudden loss level. So the Axis can't just sit back and, take Smolensk and say, okay, I'm digging in for the winner. No, you've got it. You're under some pressure to take certain amount of territory and do it quickly. And or else you'll lose the game outright. So let's assume you don't lose the game outright. Now you've got the high water mark, basically the most points that the Germans have reached. And that becomes important later on, because there's a check later where the Soviets basically have to exceed the high water mark or they lose. And then eventually there's also auto victory system for the Soviets of gaining points. So there's an initiative change in the middle of the game. So the system tracks and decides based on how the victory points are going, when has the initiative changed from the Axis to the Soviets. And so it's totally different, and much more involved than what we had in War in the East. So,
and I like the way it works, where the better the Axis player, does earlier on, the higher a bar it sets. The Soviet player then has to do better later on.
Right, exactly. So we're trying to build in some tension in the game that maybe wasn't there before, to make the Axis player, try to move forward quickly and try to generate a high water mark, basically. Mm-hmm. And if they can do that will make it harder for the Soviets later on.
And it encourages the Soviet players also not withdraw too much early on and to really fight to slow down the capture of those victory cities.
Right. Yep.
All right. So I know we're going to have multiple scenarios, ranging from the tutorial scenario to a lot of the classic, road to Leningrad, road to Minsk. What used to be the idea was road to Kiev. Now it's the destruction of the Southwest Front. Covers a bit larger of a time scale and includes Guderian coming in, but that all then goes up to several large campaigns and the big grand campaign that goes all the way from the beginning of Operation Barbarossa to the very end of World War II in Berlin, probably. And so I just don't think personally, having played a lot of these games over the years and having played War in the East too now, I don't think there's ever been a game that's as historically accurate, as playable, and as enjoyably historical in its results as War in the East 2 is. If you want the entire Eastern Front, this is an entire Eastern Front simulator, and it does it with remarkable historical accuracy and fidelity. And for those that hold a special place in their hearts for War in the East, the original, which you should, still a great game, but I think honestly you'll find War in the East 2 is better in every respect. So I'm going to put you on the spot now and ask, when do you think War in the East 2 will be available for purchase?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? Well, we think we'll probably be ready in early spring. That's what we're.
All right. Well, that sounds good. And one last question for you, and this is sort of, do you have any words of wisdom to pass along segment, looking back at all your experiences to date? If you were talking to a war game developer designer who was just starting, thinking about making their first game or currently working on their first game, what advice would you give them?
Hmm. Uh, I'd say it's in order to make a game these days, and for quite some time, it takes a big team of people. And so I would say be open to find people, find something you're passionate about, then be open to find others who are passionate about the same thing, and let them be part of that team. Because I mean, we couldn't do this game. Gary and Pavel are amazing designer programmers, but we couldn't do it without a big, large team of people who are as passionate about their parts of this game as we are. I mean, our order of battle, our Wikipedia, all kinds of pieces of this game are built by people who are as passionate about it as we are, and you really need to have that. So you never know where you're going to get the next person who can, you know, create an amazing system for you, and so just be open to that, and jump at the chance when you see these people.
Thanks. I think that's great advice. Well, with War and these two just around the corner, I think it's going to be a great start to 21 for wargamers. And I think it'll be, as with its predecessors, some of the best bang for the buck you can get in all of gaming. I think we've all lost count of how many hours we've put into the previous 2x3 games. It ends up truly being a bargain. And I'm sure we will be talking more about War and these two in the next month or two, including some detailed feature previews, some after action reports, and other promotional items. So if you're new to wargaming and you're not familiar with 2x3's games, hopefully this drew some interest and you'll give some of the other games a try. Joel, I want to thank you for being with us today. And I want to encourage everyone, give some of these all-time great games, put them on your computer, give them a playthrough.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you.